your body does get used to a certain diet and certain lifestyle. And I think switching it up makes a big difference because, again, it's creating stress to your microbiome. And that stress induces adaptation, it induces change.
What are some daily foods and supplements that people should take to optimize the way that their brains work and potentially even help prevent cognitive decline?
I would say like omega-3, it's one of the well-established foods. If possible, obtain it from the food sources like, the fish and all of that. I think healthy fats are definitely good because we know the brain is made out of primarily fats. So even though fats don't go through the blood-brain barrier to get metabolized in the brain, know that not only the brain itself is made out of a lot of fat, the structural matter of the cells, the membranes itself, is phospholipid bilayer. Phospholipid, as the name says, is lipid. It's also made out of fat. So that's how much fats actually play a role in this. And we can talk about why some people demonize fat and some people demonize glucose when it comes to excess of substrate and excess of calories that leads towards dysfunction in metabolism and cause insulin resistance. But that's generally what I would say.
So the building blocks
Building
essentially.
blocks, yeah, absolutely.
Super important. And so what are some of your favorite sources of omega-3 fats?
I love my salmon, for sure. I think at one point I was doing low carb diet and my LDL was spiking up to about 222. And doctors were getting concerned because my weight was fine, my blood pressure was fine, everything else was fine. My liver and my kidney functions were fine. So 6 months after that, so I've sort of increased my cardiovascular exercises. I've increased my aerobic exercises. And then I also increased my consumption of fish. I'm more like replacing the red meat with fish. And it went down. It cut my LDL by half, like to
Wow.
111 in 6
Interesting.
months.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what was going through your head? I mean, because you're not a medical doctor, but you are obviously an expert in so many aspects of physiology. When you saw all the different biomarkers checked out as being physiologic, normal, but then your LDL was high, were you concerned?
I wasn't like absolutely concerned to the point that I thought I was gonna develop a disease or I thought I was gonna die. I was concerned in the sense that there is no standardized reference range for people who are in keto diet or people who have, or are on low carb, high fat diet. So there is nothing to compare to. There is no standard to really give me an insight. What does that mean?
Mm.
But surely I don't want that number to go up any further. So let's try something and see if it changes. And if just swapping out, the red meats with fish and I'm still on low carb, I can still achieve my goals in terms of fitness and health. But if it does improve my LDL, then all the better. So that's my sort of scientific brain saying, let's do an elimination process and take out a variable and try and figure out what's going on.
Super interesting. We had Chris Palmer on the podcast
I
recently.
just interviewed him last week, I believe,
Oh,
and
cool.
we're meeting him tonight,
Yeah.
actually.
Oh, cool. Oh, cool.
Yeah, he is actually joining dinner.
I love that. He's great. But he pointed something out that I wasn't aware of, and that obviously I'm not a medical doctor, but that the criteria for diagnosing metabolic syndrome doesn't include LDL. So you could be in perfect metabolic health but have elevated LDL. So like I think it's what the interesting question that I think arises is, as you alluded to, we don't really know what the long-term consequences are of elevated LDL in the context of somebody who is metabolically healthy,
Mhm.
right?
And
Interesting. I'm not
and
saying
and I interviewed this Dr. Rob Cywers based in Florida on Health Vitamin Nutrition podcast, our podcast, and he described and explained this concept very well as to why people demonize lipids and associate like LDL to heart attack. And he explained that LDL itself is not the cause of clogging of the arteries, but rather it's a correlation instead of causality because of the high inflammation of the high glucose exposure and the affected recovery of the injured blood vessels. that the LDL is actually bringing in the building blocks and try to sort of fix it. And over time, as it can't fix um, the, the blood vessel injury over a long time, so it builds up and builds up and builds up, and it calcify, and that causes the clot.
Yeah.
So that was quite interesting the way he explained it.
Super interesting. And we know that good cardiovascular health is important to good brain health, which is obviously an area that you spend a lot of your time focusing on.
Actually, my PhD was in cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So
Wow.
I looked at type 2 diabetic heart metabolism in hypoxia.
Mm.
So I gave the rat hearts, type 2 diabetic hearts, hypoxic sort of conditions.
And what is that for people who are unfamiliar with the term?
So hypoxia means low oxygen. So the reason I use low oxygen as a subset of ischemia, which is, the constriction of blood vessels and the lack of blood flow into the heart, and usually that is followed by heart attack, myocardial infarction. Because if you look at ischemia, there are three things that happen. One is lack of blood flow in there, so lack of substrate going in, lack of oxygen going in, and then lack of waste and byproduct coming out. But there are so many variables there. So that's why I chose hypoxia, just lack of oxygen going in, as a subset of ischemia, because we know that oxygen is super important for any cells in our body. So because of that, the response and the reaction we are going to get from low oxygen from the cells will be very acute and will be very fast.
Mm.
So we can observe that change in regulation, that change in substrate metabolism readily in span of minutes and over over an hour, and then looking at the heart function. So that was what I studied.
Super interesting. Wow. And then, so how did that lead you to starting to become interested in and ultimately working with ketone related products?
So my passion has always been around chronic diseases because my mom's side has high prevalence of diabetes. My sister had gestational diabetes, which increases her chance of developing diabetes later on in her life by 50%. And then my late father passed away from stroke. And before that, he had a myocardial infarction. My half brother passed away from a heart attack at
Wow.
40 something. So knowing that I have such genetic makeup, and a lot of people, they're like, well, I'm just genetically predisposed to these chronic diseases. But the more I learn about physiology, the more I learn about metabolism, the more I realize there are things that I can definitely do and optimize in order to prevent myself to go through the same fate as my relatives. So from then on, after my PhD, I was working in a diabetes management program company, and then I started my own company around health tech, in helping people understand their blood markers, the blood biomarkers. And then from there on, I got approached by HVMN. I spoke to them, the co-founders Jeff and Michael, and they appreciate my knowledge around chronic disease, around metabolism, physiology, but also my background in startup and entrepreneurship. And when I joined HVMN and I learned more about ketones, well, at that time they were selling ketone ester, which we can talk about the differences between ketone ester and ketone IQ in a bit. They were selling ketone ester, and we were the first company that brought ketone ester into the market, into the world. And that ketone ester was sort of half conceived by NIH and half in Oxford by the lab at which I did my PhD in.
Wow.
So that was how we got connected. So,
Mm.
um, and then in 2019, they flew me in June. They interviewed me, met the whole team, offered me a job, and they needed somebody to run their $6 million contract with the DoD. They just got the contract then, and they needed somebody who is in science, who knows the ins and out on experiments and all of these knowledge to help run it. So I became the principal investigator for this project. And then the more I learn about exogenous ketone, and at that time, because exogenous ketone was so new, there weren't a lot of studies around exogenous ketones. Most of the studies were around performance. Not until I think about 2018, 2019, there were more studies coming out then because of the accessibility of ketone esters that people start using it for therapeutic uses. Because people are like, okay, we've treated epilepsy with ketogenic diet for more than 100 years now. We've treated other diseases. We've made people, reverse their diabetes like Virta Health with ketogenic diet. can we introduce exogenous ketone just as a hack? Or is there specific need to go into ketogenic diet? And I'm not saying one or the other. I'm saying that they both have their places. Um, and there are certain diseases that has to be treated with ketogenic diet because of the low sugar intake, lowered insulin, and the constant um, sort of almost like a flat line of glucose and insulin, and you need that. Whereas with exogenous ketones, people are still on their normal diet, which means they're still consuming carbohydrates. They'll still have their insulin pulses, but exogenous ketones have shown to decrease glucose acutely after you consume it. But people don't feel hypoglycemic because they feel energetic, if in fact, on the contrary. And that gives people the option to actually have access to both the ketones and glucose as fuel source. That was why when it started being experimented, it started with performance
Mm.
studies because people were talking about hybrid fuel. People were talking about glycogen sparing effect. People were talking about recovery, increasing mTOR activation, leucine mediated mTOR activation post exercise. So I wrote a review paper earlier, 2 years ago now, just summarizing what we know about using exogenous ketone for recovery in performance specifically. And then last year we published another review paper on possibility and potential of using exogenous ketones in traumatic brain injury and by extension neurodegenerative diseases.
Fascinating. Is there a use case for ketones in the setting of like cardiovascular disease? Because that's your
Yes.
background, right?
Absolutely. Um, I'm gonna shout out Dr. Salva Eurista. He's a scientist. I believe he's now with Cleveland Clinic. He was previously in Harvard. He is a cardiovascular scientist, published a couple papers now looking at using exogenous ketones in heart failure.
Wow.
And they actually shown improvement in heart failure in animals. Animals that were given exogenous ketones, one, the heart prefers ketone. When ketone is available, they looked at blood going in, so arterial blood and venous blood going out, and they measured substrate intake. So that way you can measure how much glucose is being taken in, how much fats are taken in, how much ketones are taken in. When ketones are present, the uptake follows with the availability of ketones.
Wow.
But the other substrates sort of plateau at a certain level when their transporters are saturated,
Mm.
which is very interesting because ketones is also being transported into the cell via transporters, MCT monocarboxylate transporter. But for some reason, it keeps going up. So I'm sure there is a saturation point, but we don't know yet. Based on the study, we haven't seen the saturation point yet. So one is the preferential fuel. Two, what they have seen is post heart failure or post myocardial infarction. So they give the animals myocardial infarction or heart attack. Most of the time, when you survive a heart attack, some parts of your heart, the cardiomyocytes, will get damaged, and your heart will try to compensate by hypertrophying, by growing bigger to compensate for that contraction and relaxation, and make sure your heart still function well. And that also increased risk of arrhythmia and increased risk of heart failure later on.
Mm.
What they have seen is that given the group that was given ketones, they actually mitigated that hypertrophy.
Wow.
So, and then they further measured all the enzymes that were involved in ketone metabolism, the transporters as well as the enzyme that converts BHB, like beta hydroxybutyrate, into acetyl CoA, hence going into the Krebs cycle, providing energy. All those were upregulated when exogenous ketones are present. Now, what does that say? That says that acutely, when you take exogenous ketones, our bodies should be readily able to transport it into the cell and metabolize it. You don't have to be keto adapted. You don't have to go on a ketogenic diet to take ketone IQ, for example. Now, how efficient you are in metabolizing it, that varies from individual to individual. But know that you will be able to metabolize it. It's almost like, say, you haven't eaten sugar for 10 years and then suddenly you eat sugar. Are you able to metabolize it? Yeah, absolutely. Your body has the mechanism designed and programmed ready to metabolize that.
Yeah, it doesn't just forget.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Okay, so walk me through all the different types of exogenous ketone supplements, both the benefits of each and drawbacks of
Perfect.
each.
Perfect. I think the longest standing exogenous ketone supplementation would be like ketone salts and MCT, right? So MCT is medium chain triglycerides. It enters the body, it gets converted into BHB. The downside of MCT is that it doesn't increase your blood BHB higher than zero point 0.5, at least in the literature. It does increase ketones to a certain level, and it has shown to have beneficial effects on Alzheimer's and cognitive impairment. I think Dr. Mary Newport has published quite a few papers on that.
Yeah, with her husband,
Yeah.
Steve,
Hmm.
the late Steve Newport, who had Alzheimer's disease, and Mary would she started giving him coconut oil,
Coconut oil.
and she
Yep.
saw this like crazy anecdote, of course, but like what how she described it, it was a pretty stark improvement in his symptomology. And then she, because of her background in I believe the neonatal ICU, she somehow connected that uh, MCTs make up a large proportion of coconut fat, and she was able to find, which of course wasn't as popular back then, but she was then able to find like isolated MCTs, and then she started giving that to her husband,
Yep.
and she didn't cure his condition, but but apparently she saw like a pretty significant improvement
Yeah.
while
Symptom.
he was under the influence of these MCTs, which is of course a transient effect,
Yep.
but
Exactly. So that gives us a proof of concept as to the benefit of ketones, right? And then we're talking about ketone salts. Ketone salts are essentially beta hydroxybutyrate. So let's go back one step further, one step back actually, on basic ketone metabolism. So our bodies create ketones ourselves. When we are under starvation or when we are low on carbohydrate sources, either glucose or glycogen, our bodies will start synthesizing or producing ketones in three different forms: beta hydroxybutyrate, acetoacetate, and acetone. Beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate usually they are in equilibrium around 50-50 ratio, but beta hydroxybutyrate is the form that is primarily being transported around the body just because it's more stable and being metabolized for energy. Acetone, usually you excrete it in the form of breath. And so so we know that beta hydroxybutyrate is very useful for energy and especially for the brain, and all of these conditions. So now going back to ketone salts. It's essentially BHB bound with any salts like sodium, calcium, magnesium, potassium. The problem with, well, let's talk about the plus. The plus is that it does increase your ketone levels up to about 0.7 to 1 millimolar
so
maximum,
more than MCTs.
a little bit more than MCTs. Um, but the problem is you're increasing salt load into your body as well.
Mm.
Now, people may argue that's good for people who are working out. If you have problem with blood pressure or kidney problems, that's going to be a problem. And in terms of GI issues as well, as you increase the salt load, you will inevitably face GI issues as well.
Mm.
So, but it is cheaper. It is much cheaper than the other exogenous ketones that I'm about to tell you now. And then we have ketone ester that came out in 2017. It's BHB bound with butanediol. So it's two molecules sort of bound together, and the bond is called an ester bond. That's why it's called ketone ester. And what happens when you ingest ketone ester is that in your gut esterase will cleave the ester bond. The BHB will go straight into your blood. Butanediol goes to your liver. Your liver converts it into BHB and further release it in a slow releasing manner.
Oh wow.
So the reason why ketone ester can spike your blood BHB up to 3 to 5 millimolar is because of the first half. Because the BHB goes directly into your blood. There is no step in between. There is plus and minuses here. The plus is that if you want to get to that high level, that is the best option right now in the market. The minus is that a lot of people think 3 to 5 is too high. People start to feel unwell. And we have seen that in our military project. when people's BHB level goes up to 5, 6, 7, they genuinely feel just unwell, just overdose on a substrate. It's just your body just trying to excrete it.
Hmm.
And then a study by McCarthy, they published a no significant improvement in physical exercise after taking ketone ester, but there is an increase in cardiorespiratory stress biomarkers
Hmm.
because there is an increase in heart rate, there's increase in breathing, and increase in perceived rate of exertion, meaning that you are feeling that you're working harder, but you're not actually getting that performance increase.
Hmm.
The reason why that is because of the spike in BHB lowers your blood pH. That has been shown across the board. And when you lower your pH, means you increase the acidity of your blood. Your body will try to balance it up and try to excrete these or try to balance that pH by excreting more carbon dioxide. So increase heart rate and breathing rate and all of that.
Hmm.
So there is an argument against having your blood pH be that high.
Got it.
And for therapeutic users, a lot of studies actually shown significant improvement as long as you reach 1 millimolar.
Hmm.
And for performance, it's between 1 to 2 millimolar.
So you're saying there's really no need to push it higher than that?
Yeah, because a lot of times when we look at supplements, we think, oh, more is better, more is better. Like vitamin C, people start popping everything, and then you're just gonna pee it all out.
Right.
It's just a waste at that point.
So these are ketone esters, correct?
Nope.
No.
These are the second generation. So from ketone ester, we evolved into ketone IQ, which is R13-butadiol. So we took half of what ketone ester was,
Okay.
and we made them chirally pure, which means, there's a fancy chemical way of saying that this translates to our BHB, which is mainly used for energy and the body. So the reason why we evolve into ketone IQ are three reasons. One, it's cheaper to manufacture. Two, it tastes better. I know it still doesn't taste like soda, but have you tasted ketone esters before?
I think I have, and they're really bad.
Yeah, literally, it's like a punch to your throat.
It's like battery acid.
It's battery acid, it's rocket fuel, whatever you call it, right? So we have one of the subtasks in the military contract is to work with Monell, which is a Century Research Center. They are experts in flavor research and R&D, and they try everything: dairy, artificial sweeteners, natural sweeteners. None of them work. I actually presented at Metabolic Health Summit the results. In, instead of masking the bitterness from ketone esters, it actually masks, or the ketone esters actually mask all the sweetness from the sweeteners.
Oh,
Like the rating of sweetness went down and the bitterness just went up. So that's very interesting. So one of the joke that I told during the presentation is that if you want your drink to taste worse, go and add some ketone esters in it if you want to mask that sweetness. So one is cheap, the accessibility. It used to cost $30 for 25 grams
I
of
remember it was
ketone
super,
ester.
super expensive.
So it was very premium. It was very super athlete performance, elite sort of supplement. Now this is $4 to $5 per serving. Huge difference. Second is taste. And then third is in terms of efficiency. So remember I talked about the problem with spiking your BHB too high.
Mhm.
You get an increase in acidity, lower the pH, you get all of that. This, because it goes through your liver, and your liver is a gatekeeper, and your liver gets all the signal from your body. Therefore, what we have seen is that it doesn't go above 2.5, even if you increase the dose.
Wow.
It's not as dose dependent as ketone ester, where the more you drink, the more you will go, the higher you will go because of the BHB that is not gated by anything. It just keeps going into your blood. Whereas this one is controlled by your liver. So we have people who are already at 1.8 millimolar, for example. When they drink ketone ester, it goes up to 2. But then we have somebody at 0.3, it goes up to 1.8. So the delta is bigger. So you still get there, but it will sort of regulate so that you don't overshoot.
Hmm.
So that's super interesting, right? And in that sense, it's a no-brainer, right? You get into that Goldilocks zone between 1 and 2, and then that's it.
Where it boosts performance.
Boosts performance or it boosts cognition. I use it personally before podcast, before my workout. I use it
Yeah, I saw you
after.
took a shot before we started
It
taping.
works every time, like magic. You should try it.
I'm gonna try one right now.
Yeah, try it
So
now.
if you're just listening to this, Latt brought in some of these Ketone IQ shots, which I am going to open up
Yep.
and sip on. Do you need? Can you
You
sip, or are you supposed to like
I
chug
would
it
I
or
would just chug it.
chug it?
I would.
Okay,
I mean, you can sip on this big one. Usually, that's what our
that's a lot.
co-founders do. Jeff and Michael. I have seen them walking around conference sipping a whole bottle. So, if you shot that one
Woo!
serving, in about 15 minutes, tell me how you feel.
All right, set a timer.
Yeah,
Okay, cool. I just looked at the clock, so
there you go.
yeah, we'll see. So what kinds of performance specifically are these purported to boost?
That is a great question. So, in the past, all the performance-based studies have been done on ketone esters. Now, let's be clear on that, right? Um, so they have always been endurance sort of sports because we know from a metabolic point of view, glucose is still king when it comes to high intensity burst energy anaerobic exercises. So let's talk about endurance for a second. We looked at cyclists, and there are a couple of papers actually, a couple of papers that show improvement in time trial, a couple of papers that show no improvement, and then another paper came out later that adds sodium bicarbonate in it. And you may ask why? Because they saw the pH drop.
Mm,
Sodium bicarbonate is base. So you sort of bring the pH back up.
it's baking soda, right?
Yeah, baking soda. Now, the problem with that is that it does induce GI issues if you take it
Mm,
too big of a dose right away. So then that paper saw 5% improvement. Um, and then another paper looked at recovery as well. So 3 weeks, Tour de France style training, 1 to 2 times training per day. They were given protein, carbs, and ketone esters after work, half an hour after workout and half an hour before sleep. 3 weeks later, they saw 15% improvement in work output. So that is a very big compounding effect of ketone ester. As to the acute use, we are still a bit unsure because the results are mixed. Because some papers said what we know is there's no detrimental effect. But if you're paying $30 for it, surely you want something out of it,
yeah.
right? So some papers showed improvement. We just wrapped up a study with the University of North Georgia with Dr. Parker Hyde on first ever study on ketone IQ because ketone IQ just launched January 2022. But it's also the first ever paper that's looking into anaerobic exercise. So very high intensity. And, the participants were asked to run 5K. And then right after that, they jump on a bike and do a wing gait.
Mm,
A wing gait is what they have been asked to do is that they were asked to go on a bike, 5 bouts of 10 seconds as hard as you can push yourself, kind of sprint at about 75% body weight as your resistance. And as you would expect, as time goes on from set 1 into set 5, you're going to get fatigue level as well. What we have seen, I mean, we are writing up the manuscript right now, so can't share too much, but we have seen an overall increase in power output
wow.
and decrease in fatigue.
Wow.
That's huge.
And this is again, this is like endurance style training, or is this
So this is anaerobic.
anaerobic?
So
So
this is
anaerobic
like
where
high intensity. So not
yeah,
endurance where you last you for endurance generally you want to last as long and you want to go fast but kind of long distance
yeah.
still. You know what I mean? Whereas this one is literally like if you go for explosiveness, like just how much energy can you put out in 10 seconds?
So like, give me some examples. Like with that, like weight training with this
Weight
potential.
training, yep, that's correct. Weight training, sprints, just in general, but just short bout but high intensity.
Wow.
Tabata, that sort of high intensity interval training. So that has never been shown before because we thought that ketones, will not be better than glucose because when you go down glycolysis, that's much faster pathway, and our bodies are very, very clever in choosing the most efficient pathway to generate energy
Yeah.
when we need them.
It's actually really elegant and interesting, I think, for like people to understand that your muscles store sugar. They don't store fat, right? Unless you're like sick,
Mm.
right? Unless you're like a Wagyu beef or something, right? Where you have like this like crazy
Marbled.
pathologic marbling, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, when you need energy like now, your muscles dip into the closest available fuel source, and it doesn't get closer than the glucose stored within those, the musculature.
And you can think about oxygen demand as well, because when you want fast energy and really high energy level, you are going into hypoxic level. You're going into low oxygen availability because you know you have that short amount of time. You can only breathe that much.
Yeah, that's what
So,
anaerobic means, right? Without
so,
oxygen.
so so glycolysis is a pathway that is independent of oxygen. It's a fast ATP generating pathway that doesn't depend on oxygen, but you do produce lactate as as a side product. That's why we were talking about lactate buildup and all of that. It's because of that. And then when you have oxygen afterwards, when you're panting and you have hyperventilating, you then get all the oxygen needed, and then you pay the oxygen debt, and then it'll go down Krebs cycle and go through electron transport chain and produce ATP.
Hmm.
So when we give in ketones, we're like, what is happening? Right? Why are they doing better? One hypothesis, it could be the glycogen sparing effect because they had to do 5K run before, and that they have the glycogen still available for them because they were using ketones earlier.
Hmm.
And we saw that, that they switch substrate. We measured the respiratory exchange ratio. So we know they're burning more glucose or burning more fat. And people on ketones, they lower their glucose consumption. Um, and that could be the reason why they could push further. But another very interesting hypothesis could be the cognition part of things, where they actually feel less painful.
Hmm.
Like, almost like an analgesic effect, like, coffee does.
Oh, interesting.
Like pre-workout, why people can push further is because they get their brain just numbs the pain a little bit,
Is
and
that what caffeine is thought
it
to
to a
do?
certain extent, the caffeine's supposed to do that.
Interesting.
Yeah. So we are still sort of exploring it in terms of mechanism of action, but, you know, we didn't expect the result to be this interesting. So we'll see what doors this open up,
Yeah.
you know? So we've talked about endurance, we've talked about recovery, we've talked about anaerobic now, so power. And then all the other use cases would be very much closer related to therapeutic areas. So Alzheimer's and diabetes, metabolic health. I interviewed Dr. Terry Walls
Hmm.
a few weeks ago.
Love her.
Love her. Like her story was so touching. She made me teary on my podcast.
Really?
Yeah, she shared her story. It was so touching. She had MS and she couldn't walk. She couldn't sit. She was on zero gravity chair, and then she cured herself basically. And the medical community was like, "You can't have MS. Nobody gets up and walk
Oh, yeah.
if you have MS,
She's
right?"
she's brilliant.
Yeah. So she shared the science and all of that. So check out HVMN podcast when the episode is out. So all these areas, so the way I see it, what are the use cases of ketone IQ, right? The way I see it is that it's brain fuel. It's energy for your brain. What does your brain do? And then you say, I use my brain for a podcast. I use my brain when I want to be in the zone for my training. I use my brain, in a sense, use my brain when I sleep in terms of I want my brain to relax. It has anxiolytic effect. So I'm going to use in those use cases. So that's how I would see how I can personalize the use case of ketone IQ to myself.
Hmm. I almost would expect there to be like almost like a psychoactive component to it, but that is there any evidence of that or no?
No, I don't think there is a psychoactive component. However, there are certain speculation that it might work synergistically well with psychoactive compounds because
Interesting.
when you have psychoactive compounds, brain scans have shown that you increase energy or brain energy demand and you increase brain activity. And when you increase energy demand, where is your brain going to get the energy from? From your body. But if you can provide ketones directly to your brain, then it could potentially be very synergistic.
Damn, that's worthy of an experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and and then some people use it for appetite suppression, and aid in their fasting. So we talk about, people wanting to fast over a long period of time, especially when, Chris Hemsworth show came out about him fasting for 4 days and all of that. And people were like, oh, I didn't know that there's, ketosis and autophagy and all of that. So
I didn't
there's
see the show. What?
it was
I mean, I know what you're talking about.
yeah, it was Peter Attia and Chris Hemsworth. It was I forgot the name of the show. Limitless.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So wait, so he had on the show he had
He
to
fast
fast.
he fasted 4 days, and he was, like, sort of documenting, like, how he
Interesting.
felt and all of that, and Peter Attia sort of, like, explaining the science behind it. They measured the blood ketone levels and all of that, so that was all very interesting, and
Got it.
people who are already in the intermittent fasting world, um, are very well versed with the feeling of being in ketosis, the feeling of being in a fasting zone and getting autophagy. So one of the ways where this really helps is the appetite suppression aspect. And I used it to fast 48 hours last month.
Hmm.
And it was definitely easier than I thought it would be.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what were you doing? You were just taking these like.
So I would take one in the morning and one at night. Um, and that was fine.
Hmm.
It was very easy. And then people would sort of argue, okay, this contains calories. This has 70 calories because it's energy, right? It's substrate. Does it break my fast? Initially, I tell people if you're fasting for calorie restriction, for weight loss, then 70 calories is not going to do anything to you. And then now, the more I learn about autophagy, the more I learn about fasting, I realize even if you have 70 calories, it shouldn't stop autophagy because you're talking about lowering insulin and lowering overall energy availability in your body. 70 calories is not going to shift the needle that much. But instead, if it helps you be productive and have the energy and go through your day normally and still be fasting, then it's a no brainer,
Yeah.
right? So that's why, and I spoke to Cynthia Thurlow, she gave a TED talk on intermittent fasting, and she agrees. Like the whole idea, it's about having low insulin, having low storage in your body,
Hmm.
and this is something that we know that our body prefers to use. So once you have it, your body will burn it out.
Wow.
And even if you don't, and if you work out, and some people might argue, will say, well, what if it increases mTOR? mTOR will inhibit autophagy. But if you work out during your fast, you also increase mTOR
Right. In muscle.
and muscle. So it's all very fascinating. I mean, there are certain genes that are tied to autophagy. The only way to prove this is to run a study that measures those genes regulation, whether they are regulated up or down during
Hmm.
fasting, with and without ketones.
Interesting. Yeah, because as far as I know, there's really no practical way to measure autophagy. It's like this really wonderful concept that we always, like to talk about, and for good reason, but it's not something that clinically is being looked at.
I believe the gene is called ATG7, but I have to double check on that. I literally just read a paper.
Hmm.
Yeah. And then, you can look at other genes, for mitochondrial biogenesis or mitochondrial autophagy, all of that.
Yeah.
So there's always different way to slice this.
What about for people that are transitioning for the first time to a lower or low carb diet or even a ketogenic diet? I remember reading a while back that there was some potential utility for exogenous ketones to helping people avert the so-called low carb flu, make that transition a little bit more seamless, easier. Any research there or
Yeah.
thinking there?
And remember what I said about the cardiovascular study research, where when they give exogenous ketones, all the enzymes and transporters were upregulated acutely. So what does that tell us? That tells us that if you're going into, or if you're planning to go into a low carb or ketogenic diet, you are scared that you're not keto adapted and you are going to have some side effects or cravings. We know that if you take exogenous ketones acutely within hours, within minutes even, you will be upregulating these enzymes and these transporters. so that when your body is finally keto adapted, or when your body is producing its endogenous ketones, because you're low on carbs and your liver is turning all the fats into ketones, your cells, your muscles, your brain, your heart, they're all ready to metabolize it.
Mm.
So that's how I would use it to transition into a low carb diet, into ketogenic diet.
Interesting. It's kind of funny that those transporters are called, or they're referred to as MCTs.
Yes, monocarboxylate transporters,
They're in the
not to
brain
be.
at the brain too, right? At the
Yeah,
level
yeah.
of the
I
brain.
mean, all the cells that bring in ketones should have MCTs.
So this kind of helps like ready the machinery
Hmm.
to be able to accept ketones as a fuel source.
Yeah, so they have an increased translocation of the transporters onto the membranes. They have increase in the enzymes that converts uh, beta hydroxybutyrate into acetoacetate into acetyl CoA
Hmm.
to go into the Krebs cycle, and that makes the machinery more efficient.
Wow. Can you speak to any of the signaling effects of ketones? Because I know that's a big sort of value add, right? Like that ketones are more than just a fuel source, at least as far as the brain is concerned. That they have interesting abilities to whether it's like increase blood flow or boost growth factors, like I don't know BDNF, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah. Dr. Luisa Nicola, who was here last week with
Yeah, she
you.
was here with us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she was here. She and I, we did a podcast on HVMN as well, and she shared a paper that increases BDN. Well, exercise resistance training, to be specific, increases BDNF and increases hippocampus size. So the hippocampus is the region of the brain that dictates learning and memory. And then another paper actually shows that the increase in BDNF caused by exercise is actually related to increase in ketones. And then I put one and one together. It's super interesting. So that, ketones does increase BDNF, and ketones also has an effect on inflammasome. And that has been shown as well.
Wow.
So anti-inflammatory purpose. Dr. Gundry talked about ketone being an inefficient fuel because it increases uncoupling in the mitochondria. And we talk about uncoupling, we're talking about leakage of energy, and that creates free radicals. Now, before I go further and say, oh, that must be bad, that sounds bad, right? But it doesn't, because leakage, uncoupling happens regularly in our cells, regardless, because that is what's needed for the mitochondria to adapt to produce more antioxidant like melatonin and glutathione. So you need a certain level of mitohomeosis to then create the antioxidants, because without a signal saying that, hey, we need antioxidant, how do you know when to create an antioxidant? It's the same as, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Same thing with workout, right? We are creating stress to the body.
Mm.
We are upregulating cortisol. We are breaking down muscles so that we can come back stronger. So the condition is that you don't break yourself in the process, and you have proper recovery strategies so that you can come back the next day and lift heavier.
Hmm.
So same thing with mitochondria. You need that sort of uncoupling to happen, and apparently ketones increase antioxidants generation through that method.
Hmm.
Um, and then I know Buck Institute is doing some really interesting work looking at beta hydroxybutyrylation, where it's a direct effect on the DNA itself, turning on and off certain genes that are related to metabolism, aging, and all of that.
Super interesting.
Yeah. So there's so many areas. So ketone is not only an energy source for the body, and then we realize, okay, it's a preferred energy source, especially for the brain. And then now we're realizing another whole area where it's a metabolite as a signaling molecule. So
Hmm.
I spoke to my supervisor back at Oxford recently, Dr. Lisa Heather, and she said, now this is the hot topic, metabolites as signaling molecule. We're looking at lactate being able to induce antioxidant effect and mitochondrial biogenesis. We're looking at, glucose being this and that, and we're looking at fats being, signaling other areas, or diacylglyceride affecting insulin receptors. So we have to look at the substrates not just as substrates purely, But in the process of them being present, it's sending signals to the cells, to the organelles, to the mitochondria to either do adaptation or increase or decrease metabolic pathways.
I mean, ketones seem like such a good thing. I mean, they do all this, to the body and to the brain, really like beneficial, these like super beneficial compounds. But what then, like, how is the average person to um, reap the benefits? I mean, of them? Like, obviously, a lot of people are interested in ketogenic diets these days. You guys make your supplements available, which is great. Ketone IQ, anybody can go and check that out. But like, typically, like prior to the availability of ketone supplements, do you think that like the ketogenic diet is something that like people we should have been on, you know, more frequently, or is it, like, do you see it as being something that seasonally can play a beneficial role, or do you think that like now with the availability of HVMN supplements, like people don't, shouldn't even be thinking about ketogenic diets unless it's for therapeutic reasons, perhaps?
I think ketogenic diet definitely has a place in therapeutic areas, epilepsy, possibly mental illness as well, as Dr. Chris Palmer talks about. Whether everyone should do ketogenic diet all the time, I don't think so. Um, Dr. Pomper talks about this quite regularly in terms of cycling, feasting and fasting, and talking about microbiome. And Paul Saladino, carnivore MD, very quite popular, talking about his carnivore diet wasn't doing him any good anymore. That's why he's going on to like carnivore diet 2.0,
Yeah.
where he introduced fruits and honey. Um,
He's just on a paleo diet at this point.
exactly, exactly. So I think your body does get used to a certain diet and certain lifestyle, and I think switching it up makes a big difference because again, it's creating stress to your microbiome, and that stress induces adaptation. It induces change, and most of the time, that change is what you feel the difference. And as far as supplement goes, I think ketones or ketone IQ could be a very powerful tool to supplement any of these diet changes. But most importantly, the foundation has to be there: your diet, your sleep, your exercise. Because if you're expecting to have ketone IQ, even though you have very bad lifestyle choices and you developing metabolic dysfunction and metabolic diseases, it's not going to do much good, right? But if you are trying to achieve all these good lifestyle habits, but you have trouble, or you every now and again you want to really feel the cognition benefit of exogenous ketone, then why not take a ketone IQ as a supplement?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Speaking of which, it has been about 15 minutes, I think. How do you feel?
I feel pretty good. I
Yeah.
feel
Do you feel
pretty
any different?
I feel so high, bro.
Not
No, I feel
that kind of supplement.
yeah, no. I feel really good. I feel no fatigue to report on, no yeah, I feel very present, very alert.
Yeah. I
Um
always tell people the way I feel after I take
I actually feel kind of
ketone IQ.
warm, but that could be just like the room,
Yeah.
or it could be that it's like,
Yeah.
turn my metabolism up.
Yeah.
Who knows?
How I feel is like I feel my brain being connected to my mouth
Mm,
at the same pace. Because sometimes your brain moves faster than your mouth or one way or the other.
yeah.
And every time I have ketone IQ before a podcast, I feel like the words can come out much fluently and my brain just follows through.
I love that. Verbal fluency.
Yeah.
That's something that's very important to me. Like I can always, as a communicator, I can tell when I'm on my game, and I feel actually pretty good.
Yeah. So going back to the diet question, now that's very important. So first of all, definitely having a strong foundation. Second of all, experiment with cycling different diets and what's good for you
Yeah.
because what's good for somebody else may not be good for you. And then third, using supplement to really push yourself to optimize further. And I have and this is I can get your thoughts around this actually. Um, One school of thought is that high glucose is increasing. The ubiquitousness of glucose is causing insulin resistance. And then I spoke to Dr. Cyrus Kambata, who co-authored the book Mastering Diabetes. He believes that fats are actually causing insulin resistance, and that his way of combating diabetes is through um, increasing carbohydrates that you have to earn.
Well, they're like vegans, the
Yeah,
mastering diabetes guys.
plant-based, yeah,
Yeah.
plant-based, like, higher glucose sort of,
Yeah.
diet. What do you think? I have my thoughts, and I can share my thoughts in a bit, but I want to pick
I
your brain on it.
I actually the more I've learned, the more I feel inclined to say that it's calorie excess, that it's just like an overfilling of the body's fat silos past a certain genetic threshold, which causes then fat to spill over into the blood as free fatty acids. You start to accumulate fat ectopically in different organ tissues, whether it's the liver, muscle, pancreas. And I think that that is what ultimately drives insulin resistance. That everybody has a different fat threshold, beyond which their fat cells become essentially overstuffed. I mean, this is like a simplification, and that ultimately it doesn't matter if the calorie excess is coming from fat or carbohydrates. I used to think that it was just overstimulation of the insulin receptor, that it was just like glucose, and
Yeah.
and it was that. But I think what's clear is that people who um, is are these like these niche studies, right?
Mhm.
Where people like go on very high carbohydrate diets and they are seemingly able to improve insulin sensitivity. I do think for somebody, so as a preventative strategy, I think it's just not getting overweight, not getting, and certainly not becoming obese. As a therapeutic treatment, I do think that there's merit to low carb diets. The research seems to validate low carb diets as a way to manage insulin resistance, right? The same way that if you're celiac, you remove gluten, you're, which is something that you are basically intolerant to as a person with celiac, then you have no symptoms, right? It's not that you've cured your celiac disease, you've just removed the stimulus. And so for somebody who's developed type 2 diabetes, they've become essentially glucose intolerant. And so you go on a low carb diet, it brings down the A1C, it brings down fasting glucose and all that stuff. But I think, like, in terms of reversing the pathology, I think you can probably get there with any kind of hypocaloric diet, provided the type 2 diabetes is not, too far along.
Yeah, too severe.
How is that for synthesis?
I absolutely love your answer, and I'm glad there's another person who thinks the same. So I am thinking along the same line. It's essentially excess of calories, regardless if you're getting it from carbs or fats. Because ultimately, what we are currently doing in this modern world is that we're consuming too much of both, right? And if you have excess of calories, you can think about it this way, right? You are piling up all these substrates and you're not burning them fast enough, so you're storing them. But what happens at the storage sites? It was still metabolizing them. Your body is still trying to keep up with the energy expenditure. Heavier people, they generally have higher um, temperature, like body temperature and all that. And sorry, you increase the energy expenditure. And we know that as we tie back to the reactive oxygen species or the free radical concept earlier, is that we know that cells with higher metabolism produces more free radical. That's just probability, right? It's just a
Hmm.
numbers thing, right? If you increase metabolism of these cells in the site, you're creating more
It's like
ROS.
exhaust,
Yeah,
right? Like,
exactly. And then when you have more ROS in these sites, either adipose tissue or muscles glycogen, you are sending signals for inflammation essentially. So and as a way to protect the cells are also now getting all these inflammatory signals to, for example, like diacylglyceride and ceramidase to adapt to, or to latch onto, say, insulin receptors to say, hey, stop taking in insulin so that we can stop taking in all these other substrates because
mm,
we are already busy working on this right now. And then everything else just stays in the blood, high glucose, right? And then that is what's causing all the damage to your kidneys, to your neurons, to, nerve endings, um, and increasing your risk of heart attack.
heart attack, neurodegeneration. Yeah, it's energy toxicity.
Mhm.
And yeah, and also insulin resistance can be caused by other things as well. Like, as you mentioned, like inflammation, environmental pollutants, chronically poor sleep, right?
Yeah.
Sedentary lifestyle. Um, there's a lot that can stress, right, can cause insulin resistance. So it's not just diet, but I think from the standpoint of diet, it's that. And it's like, fat, as I mentioned, when fat starts spilling over into the blood, I mean, it's potentially those free fatty acids that gum up the works, right? At the level of the liver, at the level of muscle.
Yeah.
So it's not, I don't think it's like an either or scenario, but I do think that for people who have already established insulin resistance, I think going on a low carb diet to manage it probably very, and also like, you know, eating lots of sugary ultra processed foods are probably, more pro-inflammatory than high fat, low carb foods like nuts, for example,
Mhm.
and the like. So it's a complicated conversation, but
Yeah, and it's multifaceted. It's a
yeah,
multifaceted condition, insulin resistance. And that is also why most of the interventions that have shown to work, they are also multidisciplinary.
yeah,
They're multimodal, where people use diet and exercise and stress management and yada 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 to really envelope the whole intervention as a package, because there are so many things at play here. We can't just do the normal basic science research where we just eliminate one variable or introduce one variable and expect positive results. We need to really think about all these different aspects of things in someone's life and improve them in order to get a reduction of symptoms or remission.
definitely. And I would also, for somebody struggling with insulin resistance, I would probably recommend a higher protein diet. And protein tends to cohabitate with fat, right? Unless we're talking about vegan, like plant-based sources of protein that tend to cohabitate with starch. Most of the time, I mean, what I'm talking about when I talk about boosting protein is animal products. It's like red meat, eggs, fish, chicken, and that tends to carry with it those, protein calories tend to carry with it fat calories to varying degrees. So yeah, so I don't typically like the whole low fat thing is not something that I would embrace because it just makes it harder to get high quality protein on a low fat diet.
Yeah,
Just doesn't make any
I I I,
sense.
I absolutely agree. I was actually thinking about this literally this morning. I was like, because I remember in my second year of my undergrad, and by the way, for disclaimer, I have always been overweight growing up. Uh, Um, you
Did you
know,
grow up here? Or did you grow up in
I
Malaysia?
grew up in Malaysia, born and bred. Until I was 20, I went to Nottingham University for my undergrad. That was my first time living abroad. And then I went to Columbia University in New York for my master's in
Wow, you're a
biotechnology.
pretty smart guy.
Uh, more
Columbia, Oxford.
just tiny little towns, you know.
Damn.
I definitely I'm grateful with the opportunities I was presented with. I've had great mentors as well, who really taught me to, grow into the person I am today. So o- it's a team effort for sure. That got me into Columbia, Oxford, my entrepreneurship sort of experience, pharmaceutical experience, and then till today. So I grew up overweight, right? Until I was 22, I was in my undergrad second year and I learned a lot about physiology and I started exercising voluntarily, right? Like before that, I hated exercise.
Hmm.
I did not like exercise. I was a smoker for 7 years. I
Wow.
did not eat healthy. I gave up smoking that year itself. Has been a long time now. Um, and the diet I was using, it was sort close to Atkins, sort of high protein, low fat, low carbs. But if I would pick between carbs and fats, I would go for carbs over fats. And then I was thinking this morning, I was like, huh, I wonder would it be possible to go back to that diet, where high, low carbs and low fat and high protein and moderate carbs. And then I thought exactly what you said. I was like, but all my steaks and fish and it's gonna increase the amount of fats anyway.
Mm.
And then if I'm adding carbs on top of that, I'm just gonna end up having excessive calories. So, that's exactly why, I'm doing a low carb diet because it's just easier when I consume because my primary, focus or primary priority would be having enough protein and everything else sort of falls into the rest of the daily calorie
Yeah.
expenditure,
I mean, if you go for lean proteins, I feel like there's been this like
like
push.
white chicken, like
Yeah, well, not I mean
chicken breast and tuna.
I mean, I had rotisserie chicken breast. It was super juicy today for lunch. It was so good. It was
Right.
like it was pretty lean. You know, you can go for like a beef tenderloin. It's not a fat-free piece of meat, but it's like I mean, I just think that like the pushback to the low fat dogma of the past has led to a lot of people sort of going overboard on the other end of the spectrum where it's like, okay, well everything now has to be high fat. And I don't really agree with that either. Like my diet is probably moderate fat, moderate to low carbs, but I'm not keto
Yeah.
and high protein. And
Yeah.
that's how I eat. And I mean, I eat a lot of, ribeyes and stuff like that, but I generally will try to go for like the less fatty because it's not like less fatty meat is going to be no fat,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
It's just that it's fewer calories for me to save for my protein.
Yeah. It's
And
like,
other things that I want to eat throughout
yeah.
the day, fruit and stuff.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what I'm doing. That's why I tell people I'm not on a strict keto diet either. I'm on sort of lower carbs. I prioritize my protein intake, and then everything else falls, around that. If my protein source that day has higher fat content, I'll make sure to adjust accordingly.
Yeah.
And again, going back to my LDL story, changing that high fat, high saturated fat red meat with some fish did me good.
Yeah.
So and it's always trial and error. And what works for one person does not work for may not work for another person. So you try that sort of method and that diet and then see how you feel.
Yeah.
And some people may prefer to have more fat. Some people may prefer to have less fat and a little bit more carbs, especially if they're feeling tired and they're just so good at metabolizing all these carbs. And if you're low on sugar, then you can't function. There are people like that.
Yeah.
So our bodies are more complicated than just data, just numbers, and just clinical trials, because clinical trials are generalization of a population. So for people who want to learn about the science, but at the same time being able to extract that data and knowledge into your own application, make sure you go in there and look closely into the demographics and the population of participants of the clinical trial,
Mm.
whether it relates to you or not.
Yeah.
If they are using just athletes, if they're just using a very small range in terms of age group, or if they're using all males or all females, you need to look at that so you don't just go to the conclusion, get one sentence is like, oh, fat is perfectly, fine for you, or fat is like superfood or whatever, and then you run with it.
Yeah.
Look into what these studies are doing to these participants and who are these participants, and then you extract that information and then superimpose that onto your own lifestyle and your own application and learn from that.
So well said, and I couldn't agree more. Like, studies on with regard to, like, body composition, weight loss, I mean, it's really important to see, like, if subjects are trained or untrained, if they started out overweight or obese, It's just it is really
Yeah,
super, super
because if you're
important.
looking at obese patient studies and they do a keto diet and they lose X percentage of weight, and then you're like, well, I've done keto diet and I lose a fraction of this. I'm like, what weight do you start with? Well, normal BMI.
Yeah. Or also, like, if they take lean participants and they put them through a intermittent fasting protocol and they see a loss in lean mass, then you might be inclined to think if you're an overweight person, not diving in and looking at the details, that, "Oh, I shouldn't fast because I don't wanna lose any lean mass." But actually,
Exactly.
you potentially wouldn't lose the same degree of lean mass as a lean person,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. Because your body will always hold on to the lean mass.
Yeah.
That would be the last thing that your body will metabolize and break down.
Yeah.
It will always, you know, glycogen will go first, and then the fats, and then the protein, because it knows the proteins have so much functional benefits to your body for survivability.
There's also a hypothetical maximum amount of calorie, transfer per pound of fat that, I believe it's like 30 something. Don't quote me on this. Well, I'm sharing it on a podcast, of course. People will quote me on it, but there's a hypothetical maximum amount of calories that a given pound of fat can release on in a 24-hour period. And so for people who are super lean and they fast, um, without, that obviously is going to imply not ingesting any protein, they risk losing lean mass way more so than somebody who's fasting and starting out with an obese condition, because they have a lot more calories that they can extract in a given 24-hour period compared to a lean person. So all that is to say, you're 100% right. You got to look into you got to actually read the studies.
Yeah.
Super important.
Yeah.
When you grew up, when you were growing up, were you consuming, because you mentioned you were overweight, a traditional Malaysian diet, or did you have exposure to like ultra processed, like Americanized foods?
It was Malaysian diet. It wasn't
Interesting.
it wasn't ultra processed. I mean, we have processed food, i.e., like fast foods, like McDonald's or A&W on special occasions like birthdays and whatnot. So generally, it's just Malaysian like cooked food. But the problem with it is the portion as well as the frequency. We'll be eating carbs, like big portions of rice and noodles, about 5 times a day. That's just how unhealthy my family was growing
Wow.
up. Not until I learned all of this and I brought back, and then they're like, "Why aren't you eating?" I'm like, "No, it's not that I'm not eating. I'm eating how normal, healthy people should be eating." And I told my mom about that. And given that my mom's side has such high prevalence of diabetes, I'm like, "Mom, we got to take care of ourselves because just because you're born into this family that has predisposition of diabetes doesn't mean that we have to submit to that fate and just let go, because we can have high quality life as long as we want, as long as we can push it and there is hope. So why should we just sit there and do nothing about it? And being healthy, it's great. You feel great. You can go for a run, you can go for walks, you can lift weights. It's so many things, and cognitively as well. You just think much clearer. There's no brain fog and all of that. So growing up, I think a big part of it is just the frequency and the portion is just so imbalanced.
Yeah.
There's no high protein amount. There's protein in there. There's a lot of vegetables, but there's huge amount of carbs and a lot of like fried things, and there is no limit to it. It's like, oh yeah, he's growing up. He's growing. Let him eat more. And I'm like, no, mom. Like, especially I'm talking to my niece and nephews now. I'm like, "Mom, no, that was what happened to me when I was growing up. Like, I
Yeah.
don't want them to go through that and then have to lose all those weight and going through that exercise phase and change." It was not easy, right? For a lifestyle change to be effective as well as sustainable, it's not easy.
Mm.
Most people fall back to their old habits. And I'm like, you don't want to train your younger generation with the bad habits because that's what they're going to bring when they grow up. And then if they want to get change, want to change their life, so yes, they can still change it, but it's gonna take a lot of effort and it's gonna take a lot of motivation as well as knowledge.
Yeah. If you're severely overweight, you are not living your best life. I don't care what anybody says. You're just not. You're just not. Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
That imagine now circulating your foods or getting different vegetables and different fruits in there. And out of nowhere, the vitamins and the minerals and the micronutrients are really just working on your internal power plant. And then internally, things are getting strong.
Yeah.
So externally, things are going to look better.